Welcome to today's Explainer. I want you to picture the scene. It's the summer of 1957. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in this terrifying standoff, literally pointed at each other like loaded guns. For over a decade, you've got this cold tension blanketing the globe, and each superpower is holding onto enough nuclear weapons to completely erase civilization from the Earth. I mean, the stakes are unimaginably high, but neither side actually wants to fire first, right? So instead, both are desperately searching for another arena. They need a way to prove they're stronger, smarter, and vastly more powerful than their rival, but without triggering a global apocalypse. Okay, let's really dive into this, because the reality of this era shatters one of our biggest historical myths. When we look back at the origins of human spaceflight, it's so easy to romanticize it as this grand, unified quest for scientific discovery. But based on the source material we're looking at today, that is completely different from reality. This era wasn't about some noble yearning to explore the cosmos. No, it was about desperate geopolitical survival. It was a high-stakes chess match where losing meant facing existential destruction. So what happens when the sky itself becomes a threat? Well, that theoretical question became a terrifying reality on October 4th, 1957. Out of nowhere, the Soviets did something completely unprecedented. They launched a small metal sphere into the sky. It was literally only the size of a basketball, weighing just 84 kilograms. And honestly, it did absolutely nothing except orbit the Earth and emit this simple, repeating radio beep. They called it Sputnik. But that single beep, it completely shattered American security, because it proved that if the Soviet Union could put an object into orbit, well, they possessed the technology to put a nuclear warhead up there too. America totally did not see it coming. And this really brilliantly illustrates the immediate, visceral panic that just swept across the United States. For its entire history, the American mainland had felt safe, right? They were geographically insulated, historically protected by two vast oceans. But overnight, that geographic protection was instantly obsolete. The panic was absolute. Newspapers were calling it a catastrophe, politicians are demanding answers, and schools literally started teaching emergency drills just in case of an attack from above. The richest, most powerful nation on Earth suddenly felt incredibly vulnerable. Which brings us to Section 2, Secrets and Stray Dogs. To truly understand how both nations mobilized so insanely quickly, we have to look at the dark, hidden origins of the rocket programs they were desperately trying to build. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that history doesn't just move in straight lines. After World War II, both America and the Soviet Union quietly recruited former Nazi scientists. In the US, this was known as Operation Paperclip. We're talking about the very same men who had built the V-2 rockets that rained down on London, killing thousands of civilians. Wernher von Braun, the man who would eventually build the Saturn V rocket that took humans to the moon, he actually designed weapons for Adolf Hitler. So the chilling reality here is that the exact same hands that built weapons of terror during the war, well, they were the ones quietly recruited to build the machines that reached for the stars. Let's track how this builds, because the Soviets struck first, and they struck incredibly fast. In this rapid, terrifying succession of victories, they kept America entirely on its heels. Just 1 month after Sputnik, they launched another satellite. Then, a few years later, a human. Each of these milestones was just a massive psychological blow to the United States, proving Soviet dominance over and over again. Let's look really closely at that second milestone in November 1957. The Soviets launched a small stray dog named Laika. They picked her up right from the streets of Moscow, making her the very first living creature in space. But the grim reality behind this? She was sent on a one-way trip. She was given absolutely no way to return, and she died within hours, all alone in the darkness above the Earth. Meanwhile, Soviet officials completely fabricated a story, telling the whole world she had survived for days, and they maintained that lie for nearly half a century. But the moment that truly shook the world really comes down to this number, 108. On April 12, 1961, a 27-year-old Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a tiny capsule sitting on top of explosive fuel and was launched into the unknown. Nobody even knew if a human body could survive the psychological and physical strain. But Gagarin didn't just survive. He orbited the entire planet in exactly 108 minutes. When he parachuted back down to a rural field in Russia, he instantly became the most famous human alive. And for the United States, it definitively proved one terrifying thing: America was losing. Moving on to Section 3, the impossible promise. So the geopolitical pressure was mounting big time, and the United States needed a response that would just change the rules of the game entirely. Just 6 weeks after Gagarin's flight, President John F. Kennedy stands before Congress to make this completely audacious gamble. To understand just how mathematically impossible his promise was, you really have to look at this number, 15. At the exact moment JFK made his massive promise, America had put exactly one human in space, giving them a grand total of exactly 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. That was it. And yet, despite that severe lack of experience, Kennedy committed to sending a man to the moon. Just to put that into perspective, that is a journey of 384,000 kilometers across the absolute void of space. The math was barely understood. The rockets they needed looked absolutely nothing like what they actually had. He was essentially committing the nation to this monumental task using completely non-existent technology. So the really crucial point here is, he promised to achieve this impossible feat before the end of the decade, just 9 years away. And he didn't stand before Congress because he was certain the engineering could be done. He did it because, in the context of the Cold War, showing any weakness to the Soviet Union was simply not an option. What followed was literally the most concentrated burst of human scientific effort in history. At its peak, over 400,000 people were mobilized to work on the Apollo program. We're talking engineers, mathematicians, programmers writing out code by hand on paper, and seamstresses hand-stitching spacesuits. The budget was staggering, the pressure from the government was unbearable, and the stakes, well, they weren't just about national pride anymore. They genuinely felt like they were dictating the future course of human civilization. Which brings us to the sobering reality of Section 4, the fatal toll. All of this immense pressure, this staggering budget, and these unthinkable stakes ultimately came with a completely devastating cost in human lives. Behind all the ambition, people were dying. On January 27, 1967, the sheer danger of this insanely rushed timeline became horribly clear. American astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were sealed inside an Apollo capsule just for a routine ground test. But a spark ignited. And because the capsule was filled with pure oxygen at a high pressure, it instantly became a raging inferno. The fire itself lasted a mere 15 seconds. But here is the clinical, tragic design flaw. The hatch required 90 seconds to open. The astronauts had 0 time to escape. All 3 perished in less than a minute. The impact of that day was absolute. America stopped. The space program went completely silent, and a grieving nation hit pause to question literally everything about their program and the frantic pace they were keeping. But while the United States halted to investigate and mourn, the Soviet Union relentlessly pressed on. Just 3 months later, the Soviets prepped a spacecraft called Soyuz 1. Now, Soviet engineers knew for a fact that the capsule was violently flawed. Actually, they had filed over 200 critical defects before the launch. But the Soviet leadership absolutely refused to delay. The political timeline established by this fierce rivalry simply couldn't wait. So, they ordered the launch to proceed anyway, with cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov strapped inside. Komarov reportedly knew the grave risks. His close friend, Yuri Gagarin, even tried to take his place just to save his life, but it was to no avail. And almost immediately upon reaching space, critical systems failed. For hours, Komarov fought to control a dying ship. He was all alone in orbit, fully knowing that despite all his efforts, death was imminent. Now, what's really interesting and tragic about this is how Komarov's death dismantles the whole cinematic idea we have of space exploration. As the capsule re-entered Earth's atmosphere, his parachutes failed to deploy correctly. His final words captured on the radio, they weren't heroic speeches meant for the history books. They were filled with raw, unfiltered anger at the leaders who had sent him up into space in a broken machine. He hit the ground at nearly full speed, tragically becoming the first human being to die during a spaceflight. In a single year, 4 highly trained, incredibly brave people had died reaching for the sky. And yet, incredibly, neither side stopped. Because in this high-stakes race of geopolitical survival, stopping meant losing, and losing was completely unthinkable. Which leaves us with this final, devastating question based on the source material we've explored in today's explainer. When national pride and military dominance push human beings past the limits of safety and reason, what is the true price of winning? Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep questioning and keep learning.